It was the spring of 1945, and the world was tired of burning. Across Europe, cities lay in ruins, bridges snapped like bones, and the air still carried the sour tang of smoke. For the women packed inside the military transport bus rattling across a dirt road in Texas, the smell of smoke meant only one thing: fire, fear, and the end of something they once called home. Yet when the bus finally stopped and the doors opened, the smoke that met them was different. It carried warmth, not terror. It smelled of hickory and mesquite, of something cooking, not dying. The sun hit them like a blow when they stepped out. The Texas air was thick, dry, humming with cicadas. Their uniforms, made for a European winter, clung heavy with sweat. The women squinted into the light, uncertain whether to expect barking dogs or gun barrels. Instead, they saw a group of men in wide-brimmed hats standing beside an open flame grill, turning meat over a pit. The men were talking easily, laughing even. One noticed the women staring and called out, "Welcome to camp," before tipping his hat. The nurse from Dresden froze in place. Her heart kicked hard against her ribs. Was this a trick? A cruel performance before punishment? Behind her, a radio operator whispered, "It smells like meat." Another woman, young and hollow-eyed, muttered, "They're mocking us." But no laughter came from the guards, no jeering, only the steady crackle of fire and the faint hiss of fat dripping onto coals. They had expected cages, punishment, humiliation. Instead, they found a camp that looked like a farm. Low wooden buildings stood in neat rows under towering oaks. A white fence circled the compound like a child's careful drawing of safety. The American flag fluttered lazily above it all, half asleep in the afternoon heat. One guard leaned against a post, sipping from a chipped enamel mug. His rifle rested beside him, not raised, not ready, just there, ordinary, almost forgotten. As they passed him, he nodded politely. It was such a small gesture, but it hit harder than any shouted order. Some of the women averted their eyes. One tried to nod back, unsure if it was allowed. Their bodies still carried the memory of discipline, of shouted commands, of running when told to, of silence under pain. Yet here silence was not demanded. It arrived on its own, heavy and strange. The nurse shifted the small satchel she had carried since France. Inside were scraps of her old life. A spoon, a handkerchief, and a photograph of her parents she could barely look at anymore. She had guarded that bag through bombings, train rides and marches. Somehow it had survived. Now she held it tighter, as if afraid this new calm might steal it away. Beyond the wire fence, the horizon stretched endlessly. Fields of dry grass rippled beneath a sky too big for belief. Cows grazed in the distance, unbothered, their tails flicking lazily. The nurse stared until her eyes blurred. The same sun that had watched her city burn now warmed this quiet land. It felt like a betrayal of the world's rules. The guards led them to a small wooden building for registration. Inside, instead of shouting or shoving, men at desks asked for their names and stamped cards with neat precision. One soldier even smiled faintly when a prisoner forgot her number and stammered through her answer. It took her longer to recover from that smile than it had to survive interrogation in France. When they were shown their barracks, the shock deepened. The floors were swept, the cots already made. A pitcher of cold water waited on the table. A woman touched it carefully, expecting it to vanish. Another poured a glass, raised it to her lips, and gasped when ice clinked against her teeth. She swallowed greedily until she coughed, then laughed. A small, broken sound she hadn't made in months. The sound drew no punishment. No one yelled. The guards simply turned away, pretending not to notice. It was almost worse than cruelty. That evening, as the sun began to dip behind the trees, the women were guided toward the mess hall. They walked in silence, the gravel crunching beneath their boots. Somewhere nearby, smoke drifted again. But this time, it wasn't the acrid stench of war. It was something rich, heavy, and almost unbearable. It smelled like memory. It smelled like home. One woman closed her eyes and whispered, "It's Sunday." Another shook her head, tears threatening to fall. The scent pulled at them like a ghost, fat sizzling, wood burning, air shimmering with heat. For a heartbeat, the nurse imagined her mother's kitchen, the windows fogged with steam, her father laughing over a pan. Then the vision shattered as the guards motioned them inside. In the mess hall, long tables stretched beneath bright hanging lamps. On each tray was food, real food. Beans, cornbread, and a thick piece of grilled beef. The meat was pink at the center, glistening with juice. No one moved. The women stared, hands trembling, waiting for the trick, the slap, the order to drop it. But nothing happened. The nurse picked up her fork and took a small bite. The flavor hit her like a memory she wasn't ready for. Smoke, salt, life. Her throat tightened. It wasn't hunger that made her shake, it was grief. Around her, others began to eat. Some chewed slowly, reverently. Others broke into quiet sobs. One woman laughed through tears, clutching her cornbread like a holy object. A guard near the door watched them quietly, his hat tilted low. When a prisoner dropped her fork, he stooped to pick it up and placed it gently back on her tray. No smirk, no words, just a simple gesture. She stared at him, unsure whether to thank him or fear him. Outside, the wind shifted. The scent of hickory curled through the open windows, thick and alive. It wrapped around the barracks, around the fences, around the women who had come expecting pain and found something worse. Kindness. The morning after their arrival broke with a golden stillness. The sky above the Texas camp stretched endlessly, painted in pale blue and streaked with white clouds that moved slow as breath. The air smelled faintly of dust and smoke, the kind that clung to wood and leather rather than war. For the women who had lived through bombardments and starvation, the silence felt too large. It pressed against their ribs, whispering that something must be wrong. A bell rang somewhere near the mess hall. The sound was soft, almost musical, and yet every woman stiffened as if struck. Routine was still written into their bones. A call meant orders. Orders meant survival. They lined up without being told, their shadows long across the dirt. The guard at the head of the row wasn't shouting. He leaned against a post, his hat tipped forward, a half smile touching his mouth as if the world hadn't just ended. "Breakfast's waiting, ladies," he said. The words barely made sense. Inside, the mess hall glowed with morning light, rows of tables gleamed, and the air shimmered with warmth from stoves. The smell hit them first. Eggs, toasted bread, something fried. A few women stopped in the doorway, unable to move. One of them, a former nurse, gripped the frame until her knuckles whitened. Another whispered, "They're feeding us again?" It felt impossible. They moved forward slowly, trays clutched like shields. The cooks behind the counter, sunburned men with rolled sleeves, served without comment. On each tray landed a scoop of beans, a slice of cornbread, and a piece of grilled meat still glistening from the fire. The meat alone was enough to break them. Some froze, refusing to touch it. Others trembled as they stared. The young radio operator whispered, "There must be a reason for this. There's always a reason." When the women sat, no one spoke. Forks hovered, eyes darted. The nurse from Dresden took the first bite. The moment the flavor reached her tongue, she stopped chewing. It wasn't just food. It was memory. Smoke, salt, warmth. For an instant she was home again, standing in her mother's kitchen, listening to the hum of a radio that no longer existed. Her throat closed. Tears gathered and slipped down her cheeks before she could stop them. Across the table, another woman laughed, a sharp, nervous sound that cracked the silence. She clapped her hand over her mouth, expecting to be punished, but the guard by the door merely looked up and smiled. No reprimand came, no anger, just that quiet, unbearable calm. The laughter died, but something else took its place, curiosity. They ate, cautiously at first, then faster. The room filled with the sound of cutlery, soft sighs, muffled sobs. Some women closed their eyes as they chewed, trying to make sense of the kindness. One whispered, "The enemy feeds us better than our officers ever did." No one argued. Another muttered, "They want us to feel shame." But the shame, when it came, wasn't because of what the guards had done. It was because the food tasted so good. At the far end of the table, a woman named Marta held her fork but didn't eat. She stared at the meat, jaw clenched, eyes hollow. "My brother died in the east," she said quietly. "He starved in the snow. How can I eat this?" No one answered. Around her, forks slowed. Even those who had been eating stopped for a moment, their hunger tangled with guilt. When the meal ended, the guards didn't rush them out. They lingered, collecting trays, offering water refills, wiping tables. The smallest gestures cut deepest. One young soldier bent to pick up a napkin that had fallen. When he straightened, he nodded politely to the woman who had dropped it. She could barely look at him. In that nod lived a kind of mercy she didn't know how to return. Outside, the air shimmered. The same smoke that had greeted them yesterday rose again, winding through the trees. The scent followed them back to their barracks, stubborn and sweet. It clung to their hair, their clothes, their thoughts. Some tried to ignore it. Others breathed it in until it hurt. The barbecue smoke didn't smell like war. It smelled like forgiveness, and that was far harder to bear. Days passed, and meals continued. The menu changed little, but every plate carried the same confusion. Some women began to eat freely, their bodies remembering what hunger had erased. Others resisted. They nibbled at beans, hid bread under their pillows, pretended they were fasting for honor's sake. One woman whispered, "If they stop feeding us, I'll have something left." She tore her meat into strips and wrapped it in cloth, tucking it beneath her mattress like contraband. Survival, even in kindness, was still a habit. The guards didn't seem to understand the storm they had caused. To them, feeding prisoners was duty, not compassion. They joked among themselves, swapping stories of home, the drawl of their voices foreign and musical to German ears. Once, when a young cook noticed a prisoner eyeing his ladle suspiciously, he laughed and said, "It's not poison, ma'am, just barbecue sauce." The absurdity of his words broke something loose. A few women laughed for real this time, the sound echoing off the walls like something alive. Even the cook joined in, shaking his head. That moment of laughter felt like rebellion, the first unguarded joy since the war began. Later, as dusk settled, the nurse sat outside the barracks and watched smoke curl into the pink sky. Around her, others whispered or wrote letters that would never be sent. She thought of the meal again, the flavor, the warmth, the guilt. Nothing in her training had prepared her for this. Survival was supposed to come with pain, not generosity. She pressed her hands together and whispered, "Why are they kind?" Inside the barracks, another woman muttered in her sleep, dreaming of family dinners and candlelight. The guard walking his round paused near the window, hearing the soft voices, the restless turning. Texas sun was already high when the women filed into the mess hall again. Days had begun to blur, but the smells never did. Smoke, salt, the faint sweetness of cornbread, the strange luxury of coffee. What had once been terror had become confusion, and confusion was harder to endure. No one had shouted, no one had struck them, yet the women felt the same unease as soldiers before battle. Kindness, it turned out, was its own form of assault. The nurse from Dresden sat near the window, her hands folded tightly on her lap. The food was good, too good. It tasted of everything she had been taught to mistrust. She glanced around the table at the others. One woman ate with slow, mechanical movements, chewing as if each bite cost her something. Another woman, Elsa, hadn't touched her tray in 2 days. "I can't," she whispered when asked. "My mother has nothing but weeds to boil. If I eat, I betray her." Her eyes stayed fixed on the meat, glistening and rich. The guards noticed but said nothing. They were used to silence. What they didn't understand was that this silence was not fear, it was guilt. The women had survived bombings, starvation and loss, yet nothing prepared them for the humiliation of being treated as equals by their captors. To be offered a warm plate by the enemy was worse than any insult. It stripped away the armor of hatred they had worn for years. That afternoon, a woman named Hilda broke. She slammed her spoon down, spilling beans across the table. "Why are they doing this?" she hissed. "Why pretend to be human?" The guard nearby looked over, startled but didn't respond. Hilda's hands shook as she whispered, "If they hate us, it makes sense. If they pity us, then everything was for nothing." No one answered her. They couldn't. The thought hung in the air like smoke that refused to clear. After lunch, the women were allowed to walk outside. The fences shimmered in the heat, their barbs catching sunlight. Beyond them lay fields of grass and trees too. Calm to be real. Some of the women lingered near the edge of the yard, staring out as if distance could explain their captivity. One of the guards, a tall man with a kind face, leaned against a post and sipped from a tin cup. He caught their eyes and smiled faintly. "Pretty view, isn't it?" he said. The German women looked away, pretending not to understand. but his tone, easy and unthreatening, stayed with them long after they returned inside. That evening, the mess hall served something new, brisket coated in a thick reddish-brown glaze. The smell alone filled the building with warmth and dread. One of the younger women, a secretary from Berlin, eyed her portion suspiciously. "What is that?" she whispered. She dipped a finger into the sauce, sniffed it and licked it cautiously. Her face contorted. She gagged and spat it onto the floor. "It's poison!" she cried, half panicked, half hysterical. The hall froze. For a second it felt as if time had turned backward, that the cruelty they expected had finally arrived. But then the cook behind the counter, an enormous man with a red bandana, threw up his hands and laughed. "That's just barbecue sauce, darling," he said, his accent rolling out like slow thunder. Sweet, not deadly. His laughter was so genuine, so absurdly human that the tension cracked open. Someone giggled. Someone else snorted. Even the secretary began to laugh through her tears, pressing a hand to her mouth. That small eruption of laughter traveled through the room like a spark finding dry grass. It wasn't defiance, and it wasn't forgiveness. It was release. For a moment, the women remembered how to be ordinary. The guards chuckled quietly, shaking their heads. A prisoner near the back muttered, "They even laugh like us." After the meal, the nurse sat on the steps of the barracks watching the sky fade from gold to purple. The air smelled of wood smoke and the faint sweetness of cooked fat. Somewhere, a harmonica played, a few simple notes, clumsy but tender. She closed her eyes. It had been years since she'd heard music without orders behind it. The sound made her chest ache. Inside, Elsa lay on her bunk, still refusing to eat. Her journal lay open beside her, the pencil trembling in her hand. "Why should I live well when my country starves?" she wrote. "Why should I sleep in a bed when others sleep in rubble?" The words blurred as tears fell on the page. She closed the book and turned her face to the wall. That night, when the lights dimmed, the camp grew quiet again. The women listened to the faint rustle of leaves and the steady rhythm of guards pacing outside. Some prayed. Some stared into the dark, fighting thoughts they could no longer control. The nurse thought of the cook's laughter, of the guards' gentle nods, of how these strangers treated them as people. It was disorienting, almost cruel. The next morning, when breakfast was served, Elsa finally lifted her fork. The others watched in silence. She brought the food to her lips and swallowed slowly, eyes wet but steady. "It tastes like guilt," she whispered. The nurse nodded. "Guilt," she agreed, "but also mercy." The words spread quietly through the camp. Mercy. It was a word they had nearly forgotten. Mercy meant choice, and choice meant humanity. For some, that realization was terrifying. If the enemy could be kind, then the war had not been what they believed. Days turned into a fragile rhythm. The guards began to speak more freely, offering greetings, sometimes jokes. One afternoon, a guard dropped a handful of sugar cubes onto a table and winked. "For your coffee," he said. The women stared, too stunned to respond. Sugar had become a symbol of wealth back home, a memory of childhood. When he walked away, they divided the cubes carefully, each woman taking one as if it were treasure. That night, the nurse dreamed of her mother again, of the smell of bread rising in a warm kitchen. When she woke, the dream left her trembling. By early summer of 1945, the war that had once roared through their dreams now whispered from memory. The newspapers in the American camps spoke of surrender, reconstruction, and treaties. But for the women behind the fences of Texas, peace did not arrive like a bell. It crept in, slow and uncertain, like fog after a storm. Their bodies had begun to heal. Their skin no longer clung to bone. Yet the quiet around them felt wrong, unnatural, like the pause before another explosion. The nights were the worst. The nurse from Dresden often lay awake, listening to the stillness. No bombs, no footsteps, no screams, no sirens, only crickets and the soft hum of the planes. Her mind, trained to expect chaos, searched for danger in every sound. When she closed her eyes, she saw fire over rooftops, faces she could not save, the white light of flares falling like snow. She would wake gasping, clutching the blanket that was too clean, too warm, too undeserved. One night, unable to bear it, she sat up and whispered into the dark, "It's too quiet." Across the barracks a voice answered, Something must be coming. But nothing ever came. The guards paced their usual rounds. The stars burned steady above, and the silence only grew thicker. Peace, it turned out, carried its own kind of terror. It was the terror of waiting for pain that never arrived. The women had lived so long under noise that safety itself became a wound. One woman, Marta, folded and unfolded her blanket for hours each night until her hands stopped shaking. Another prayed out loud until her voice went hoarse. In the dimness, they whispered names of cities, Hamburg, Bremen, Berlin, as if speaking them aloud could prove those places still existed. Days were easier. Work filled the hours. They cleaned their barracks, washed clothes, swept the walkways. The guards handed out new tools and sometimes even newspapers. The headlines were strange to read: victory in Europe, rebuilding Germany, prisoners of war to be repatriated. None of it felt real. For these women, captivity had not ended with surrender. It had simply changed shape. After breakfast each morning, the guards allowed them to walk the perimeter in small groups. The fence gleamed in the sun, its barbs rusting, its shadow stretching across the dust. Beyond it lay pastures dotted with cows and the distant glimmer of a windmill. The land was quiet in a way Europe no longer knew how to be. One of the women said softly, "The world here never learned fear." Another replied, "No, it only learned how to forget." The guard called Thomas, the one they nicknamed the farmer, sometimes stood near the gate, hat tilted low, watching them. He always nodded when they passed, and sometimes he spoke a few words of English too slow to understand. Yet even those words carried no threat. His ease confused them more than his rifle ever could. He whistled while he worked. The sound reminded the women of the radio tunes they had once heard before the war drowned everything. Letters began arriving then, carried in burlap sacks by soldiers who walked from barrack to barrack reading out names. The first letter the nurse received was from a cousin she barely remembered. The handwriting shook. The words were few. "Dresden is gone, mother gone, father missing, I am alive." She read the note again and again until the paper tore. That evening she didn't go to dinner. The meal that had once seemed like proof of survival now tasted like betrayal. Around her, others sat on their bunks holding scraps of paper, faces blank, hands trembling. Some wept, some stared at the floor, a few refused to open their envelopes at all, afraid of what truth might live inside. The guards did not understand the sudden silence that swept through the camp. They thought the women were ungrateful, that the food or the heat had finally broken them. But the women were breaking for a different reason. They had seen their own deaths written in ink from home. That night, the barracks filled with the smell of smoke from the evening fire pit. It drifted through the open windows, curling around the women like a memory. The nurse buried her face in her pillow and cried. The scent, once comforting, now felt cruel. How could warmth still exist while their families froze? The next morning, a few of them refused to eat. Others forced themselves, but did so with eyes closed, as if each bite erased someone they loved. When a guard placed a cup of coffee before one woman, she pushed it away. "My sister drinks melted snow," she said quietly. "I can't." The guard hesitated, not knowing what to say. He simply nodded and walked on. Later that week, the camp commander allowed some of the women to write back. Paper was rationed, ink scarce, but the chance to speak was everything. The nurse wrote carefully, her handwriting trembling across the lines. "I am alive. They treat us kindly. I do not know how to feel about it." She hesitated, then added a final line. "Sometimes I'm afraid of peace." Days stretched long under the relentless sun. The women found small ways to fill them, gardening, mending clothes, learning a few words of English from the guards. One evening, Thomas brought a harmonica and played near the mess hall. The song was slow, almost mournful. A few of the women stopped to listen. The nurse felt something stir inside her that she couldn't name. She didn't know whether to cry or smile. The notes floated through the air like ghosts refusing to leave. That night the silence returned, but this time it felt different, softer, less like punishment, more like the echo of something that might one day become forgiveness. The nurse lay in her bunk, staring at the ceiling, tracing the wooden beams with her eyes. She thought of Dresden, of the sky on fire, of her mother's last letter. She thought of Texas, of smoke that smelled of food instead of death, and of men who nodded instead of shouted. The contradiction tore at her. But she no longer tried to resist it. War had taught her how to survive. Peace was teaching her how to feel. She closed her eyes and whispered, "Perhaps peace is not silence. Perhaps it is the sound of breathing without fear." Outside, the wind rustled through the tall grass. Somewhere in the distance, a coyote called. And for the first time since captivity began, the nurse did not flinch. The morning sun rose pale and forgiving over the Texas camp. Its light touched the barbed wire fences until they glowed like silver threads, almost beautiful from a distance. The bell rang softer than usual, and the women stirred from their bunks with the same quiet obedience that had become routine. But this morning there was something new in the air. A rumor that passed from bed to bed before breakfast was even served. The guards were asking for volunteers. No one knew why. Whispers fluttered through the barracks. "They need translators. They're moving us again. It's a trick." The nurse from Dresden said nothing. She had stopped believing in rumors the way some people stop believing in prayers. Yet when the door opened and a tall guard stepped inside with a clipboard, the tension rippled through them all. "Morning, ladies," he said. His accent dragged the words like honey. "The ranch out past the fence needs some work done. Fences to mend, hay to move, a few chores." He paused, looking around at the faces staring back at him. "We could use some help. Voluntary, of course." The room went still. Voluntary. It was a word they didn't trust. In every language of war, that word had been twisted to mean the opposite. Still, curiosity was stronger than fear. A few hands lifted hesitantly, then more. The nurse raised hers last. An hour later, a dozen women stood by the gate, the same gate they had walked past every day but never crossed. The guard named Thomas checked their names, then nodded to the sentry. The heavy lock turned. For the first time since arriving, the door to their confinement opened outward. They stepped into the world beyond the wire, blinking under the bright expanse of sky. The earth smelled of dust and grass. Wind pushed against their hair, carrying the faint scent of cattle and sunlight. For weeks the horizon had been something they could only stare at. Now it waited like a question. The work was rough. Their hands were soft from captivity, muscles weak from months of limited movement. The first task was mending a stretch of wooden fencing along the field. The nurse struggled with the wire, the sharp barbs catching her palms. She bit back a cry. A cowboy standing nearby noticed and walked over, his steps slow, deliberate. "You'll cut yourself to ribbons like that," he said gently, offering a pair of leather gloves. "Ain't no shame in learning." She looked at him, unsure how to react. No mockery, no pity, just a simple offer. She took the gloves and nodded. "Danke," she whispered. He smiled faintly, not understanding the word but understanding the tone. By midday, sweat darkened their uniforms. The sun burned hot against their necks. The women paused for water, sitting on overturned buckets and fence rails. The guards and cowhands shared canteens, and a pot of thick coffee brewed over a fire. The smell was bitter, comforting. One of the younger prisoners took a sip and nearly spat it out. "It tastes like burnt dirt," she said, wrinkling her nose. Laughter broke out, real laughter this time, light and unexpected. Even the cowboy laughed, tipping his hat. "That's the good kind," he said. The nurse caught herself smiling. It felt dangerous, like breaking a rule she hadn't known existed. The laughter faded into a calm that felt too human for enemies. For a few moments, they weren't captors and captives. They were just people standing in the sun, too tired to hate. After lunch, they stacked hay in a nearby barn. The air was heavy with the scent of straw and sweat. Dust motes floated in beams of light cutting through the slats. The women worked in pairs, their movements slow but steady. One woman hummed under her breath, an old German lullaby. The cowboy beside her began whistling along without realizing it. When their melodies met, the air filled with something strange and soft. Later, during a break, an older rancher leaned against a post, wiping his brow with a cloth. His eyes crinkled kindly. "You miss home?" he asked, his tone casual but heavy with meaning. The question landed like a blow. For a moment, no one answered. Then the youngest of the group, barely 20, whispered, "Yes, but I do not know what is left of it." The man nodded slowly. "War takes a lot," he said simply. No one spoke after that. The wind filled the silence, carrying the creak of the barn roof and the distant lowing of cattle. The women returned to work with eyes that saw differently now. When the sun began to sink, the guards gathered the women for the walk back. Their hands were raw, their faces streaked with sweat, but something had shifted. As they neared the gate, the nurse looked back once more at the fields stretching into gold. Beyond them, the horizon shimmered with heat and freedom. For a moment she wondered if the fence had ever really been the prison, or if it was something they carried inside themselves. That night, the barracks felt smaller, but warmer. The women spoke in low voices, recounting the day's small miracles, the glove, the laughter, the question. "They don't hate us," Marta said softly. "Not even a little." Elsa frowned, her voice sharp. "That doesn't make them our friends." "No," the nurse agreed. "But it makes them human." They fell silent. Each woman turned inward, feeling the strange, unfamiliar weight of compassion. For years they had been told kindness from the enemy was a lie, a trap, an illusion meant to weaken resolve. Yet what they had found beyond the wire didn't feel like illusion. It felt real, as solid as the gloves in the nurse's hands and the soreness in her arms. Before lights out, the nurse opened her small journal and wrote a single line. "I expected chains. Instead, I held a hammer." She paused, then added, "I expected cruelty. Instead, I was asked if I missed home." When the lights dimmed, she lay awake, staring at the ceiling. The fence outside glinted under the moonlight, still there, still sharp. But its power had changed. It no longer separated good from evil. It separated people who feared each other from those learning, painfully, not to. The night was quiet, peaceful in its own fragile way. Somewhere beyond the wire, a coyote called again, long and low. The sound slipped through the cracks in the wood and settled in her chest like a heartbeat. She closed her eyes, whispering to herself, "Maybe the world doesn't heal through walls." The first thing they noticed was the blackboard. It appeared one morning in the recreation hall, nailed to the far wall between two dusty windows. Beneath it stood a few benches, arranged neatly as if waiting for a school that had been forgotten. The women gathered around, unsure what it meant. The word classroom had been written on a paper sign tacked above the door. The guards explained in slow English, half with words, half with gestures. "Lessons," they said. "English lessons." At first the idea seemed absurd. Why learn the language of the victors? Why fill their mouths with the sounds of the people who had conquered them? The word no rose quickly among them, whispered from bunk to bunk. But boredom is a stubborn teacher. After weeks of repetition, cleaning, eating, sleeping, the women began to drift toward the hall, curiosity stronger than pride. A young guard named Miller was their first instructor. He was no scholar, his accent dragged every word, but he was patient. He drew pictures on the board and wrote the words beneath them. Apple, book, freedom. The women repeated them hesitantly, voices uneven, accents thick. They stumbled and laughed, sometimes at themselves, sometimes at him. Miller only grinned. "That's all right," he said. "I still can't say your names right either." Ilse, the sharp-tongued secretary from Berlin, was the first to take it seriously. "If we are to live among enemies," she said, "we should at least know what they are saying." Her confidence drew others in. Soon the benches filled each morning, the hall buzzing with strange rhythms. German mouths shaping English words, syllables colliding like mismatched gears. The lessons grew longer. New words appeared on the board: family, river, home. The guard taught them how to say "my name is" and "I like coffee." He taught them "thank you" and "please" and how to smile without meaning to. At first it was a game, but language has a way of changing more than words. Once the women learned to say friend, the meaning began to sink in. It opened a space in them they didn't know existed. Books began to appear. The Red Cross had sent donations, tattered novels, children's readers, even a few newspapers. The nurse found a battered copy of Tom Sawyer. She didn't understand every word, but she recognized the rhythm of youth, mischief, adventure. She read under her blanket at night, tracing each line with her finger until the pages felt like home. One evening, the guard Miller brought something new, a small phonograph and a stack of worn records. The women gathered around as he wound the crank. Static filled the air, then music, guitars, a fiddle, a man's voice singing about trains and rivers. It was nothing like the proud marches of Germany. It was slower, aching, full of longing. The room fell still. One woman whispered, "He sings like someone who lost something too." After that, the music played every evening. The guards let them sit near the doorway to listen. Sometimes Miller would hum along, sometimes an older guard with a beard brought a harmonica and played until the stars rose. The women didn't understand the words, but they understood the feeling. It was the first time since the war began that they felt music without marching, without orders, without cause. Weeks passed, and the classroom became part of their days. They laughed at their mistakes, corrected each other, and slowly, without realizing it, began to speak small phrases to the guards. "Good morning, thank you. Coffee, please." Each word softened the distance between them, but kindness carried risk. One afternoon, after class, Renate, the quietest among them, stayed behind. She had struggled with the day's lesson, mixing up freedom and family. Miller noticed and asked gently, "You okay?" She hesitated, then looked up at him with tired eyes. "Do you really believe," she asked slowly, "that we are all the same?" He didn't answer right away. He stared at the floor, then nodded once. "I want to." She studied his face for a long moment. Then she whispered, "So do I," and walked away. That night, Renate sat on her bunk, turning over the flashcards they used in class. One showed a picture of a mother and child. The word beneath said love. Another showed two hands shaking. The word said friend. She stared at it until her vision blurred. For years, those words had belonged to one side of the war. Now, they belonged to both. In the days that followed, something began to change in her. She no longer looked at the guards as faceless. She saw names, expressions, the weariness in their shoulders. She began greeting them in English, her accent awkward but brave. The first time she said, "Good morning," Miller grinned like a child and tipped his hat. She laughed, surprised at herself. Soon others followed. The fences no longer looked so cruel. The air felt lighter, the sky less foreign. Yet beneath that warmth, guilt still coiled like a snake. Some women whispered that learning English was surrender, that speaking with the enemy meant forgetting the dead. But the nurse disagreed. "To understand," she said quietly, "is not betrayal. It is survival." One evening, as the sun bled orange across the fields, the women gathered near the fence and practiced their new words aloud. "Sunset," Ilse said proudly. "Sky, home." Each word floated upward, soft and trembling. The guards nearby listened without interrupting. When darkness fell, Miller took out his harmonica again. The melody drifted over the camp, slow and wistful. The nurse closed her eyes, repeating the new word she had learned that day. Freedom. She whispered it in both languages, Freiheit and freedom, feeling how different they tasted. One belonged to her past, the other belonged to something she couldn't yet name. That night she wrote in her journal, "Language is a bridge made of fragile words. Today I stepped onto it." As she closed her notebook, she realized the war had already begun to fade, not because it was forgotten, but because it was being translated. The enemy had given her a new language, and with it, the ability to ask dangerous questions. If the enemy could smile, if he could teach her to say thank you, if he could listen to the same music and feel the same ache, then what had the war really been for? She lay back on her bunk, whispering the word again to the quiet air. Freedom. It was only a sound, but it carried a new kind of truth. And for the first time since the world began to burn, she felt the smallest, most human thing of all. Hope. Letters arrived on a morning washed in light. The Texas sky was cloudless, the air already thick with heat, but inside the camp, hearts turned cold. A soldier came walking between the barracks with a burlap sack slung over his shoulder, the top folded down to keep the envelopes from blowing away. The women gathered as he called out names, his accent bending them into strange new shapes. For weeks they had waited, praying for news, dreading it all the same. Now that it was here, no one breathed. The nurse was one of the first. Her hands trembled as she took the letter, thin paper soft from travel, corners torn. She stared at her name written in familiar German script, her sister's handwriting. For a long moment she could not open it. Her fingers refused. Around her, others wept or laughed in disbelief, clutching their envelopes like relics. A woman from Bremen kissed hers before reading, whispering, "Thank God, thank God." Another simply held it to her chest and refused to move. The nurse finally unfolded the paper. The words were short, each one pressed hard into the page as if carved by grief. Dresden is gone. Mother gone. Father missing. I am alive. That was all. She read it again and again until her eyes could no longer see. When she lowered the letter, the camp looked the same fences, the same sunlight, but it was not the same world. Elsa's letter came next. Her hands shook so badly she had to ask another woman to read it aloud. The bakery is gone. The river froze again. We burn furniture to stay warm. If you are alive, stay where you are. It is better there. The final line broke her. She covered her mouth and turned away, sobbing into her sleeve. The guards, uncertain what to do, stood back near the gate, silent. They had seen fear before, anger, even defiance, but not this. This was grief with nowhere to go. By noon the camp had fallen quiet. No laughter, no lessons, no music. Only the rustle of paper and the sound of hearts cracking in unison. The nurse sat beneath the oak near the fence, staring at her letter until the words blurred into meaningless lines. The guilt came quickly, heavier than hunger. She looked toward the mess hall where the smell of lunch drifted through the air. Roasted meat, fresh bread, and she felt her stomach twist. How could she eat when her sister boiled weeds to stay alive? That evening she didn't go to dinner. Others stayed behind as well, sitting on their bunks in silence. The guard Miller came by with a tray, setting it gently beside her. "You should eat," he said softly. She shook her head. "My family starves," she whispered. "If I eat, I forget them." He tried to answer, but the words would not come. He left the tray untouched. In the following days, the camp seemed to dim. Even the sunlight looked duller, as if ashamed to shine. The women moved through their chores like ghosts. Some tore up their letters, unable to bear them. Others read theirs again each night until the paper frayed. A woman named Hilda burned hers completely and scattered the ashes in the dirt. "If I can't go home," she said, "then I'll send my sorrow there instead." Meals became a quiet form of protest. Trays went half-finished or untouched. Coffee cooled before lips met it. The guards didn't understand. They thought the women had lost their appetite from heat or boredom. They didn't see that it wasn't hunger they resisted. It was mercy. One afternoon, the nurse watched as a soldier carried a bin of scraps toward the fire pit. Inside were bones, bread crusts, uneaten meat. When he tipped it into the flames, the smell of smoke rose thick and sweet. Something inside her snapped. She ran forward, grabbing his sleeve. "Don't," she said sharply. The guard froze, startled. "Children are dying for this," she cried, pointing to the burning food. Her voice shook with rage and despair. "Children!" The soldier hesitated, then lowered his eyes. He had no answer. The meat hissed and blackened. The nurse stepped back, shaking, tears cutting clean lines down her dusty cheeks. That night, the barracks was silent. The women sat together in the half-dark, letters clutched in their hands. Someone whispered, "Why do they feed us while our own people starve?" The question hung heavy, filling the space like smoke. No one replied. There was no answer that made sense. In the following week, more letters arrived, each one a fresh wound. They spoke of ruins, of sickness, of people digging for roots in frozen soil. Every word stripped away another layer of safety the camp had built. The women began to flinch at kindness. A guard offering coffee became an accusation. A clean bed felt like betrayal. One woman wrote in her journal, "They treat us like humans while our country dies. I wish they hated us. It would be easier." The nurse tried to keep writing to her sister, but each attempt failed. Every letter ended the same way. "I cannot explain what it feels like to be safe when everyone you love is not." She would fold the page, then tear it apart before it could be sent. By late summer, even the guards had grown quieter. The lessons stopped. The music from the phonograph gathered dust. The laughter that once drifted through the yard had vanished. The women no longer asked when they would go home. Home had become a word too painful to speak. One evening, as the sun bled red across the sky, the nurse sat near the fence holding her letter. The air smelled faintly of burning wood from the kitchen fires. It was the same scent that had greeted her the day she arrived, the same that had once promised safety. Now it only reminded her of distance. She thought of the barbecue meal that had shocked them all, of the kindness that had felt like betrayal, of the language lessons and the music that had softened her heart. All of it seemed impossible now. She pressed the letter to her chest and whispered, "Forgive me for surviving." Behind her, the guard Miller stopped mid-step, hearing her words. The announcement came at dawn. A whistle cut through the stillness, and the sound carried across the camp like the echo of a memory. The women rose from their bunks, disoriented, half believing it was another dream. The guard at the door said it plainly, almost softly. "The war's over. You'll be going home soon." The words hung in the air, strange and weightless. Home. The sound of it felt foreign, as if it belonged to another lifetime. For months they had dreamed of this day, imagined it through the ache of hunger and the silence of nights when the wind spoke louder than their voices. Yet now that it had arrived, no one moved. The nurse sat on her cot, her letter folded in her lap, her eyes fixed on nothing. Home was no longer a place she could picture. It was rubble and loss. It was a ghost. By mid-morning, the barracks were full of motion. Blankets were folded, small bags packed, the few personal things they had gathered tucked carefully into bundles. One woman found a flower pressed between the pages of her notebook and held it for a long time before letting it fall to the floor. Another brushed dust from the Bible she had been given by a guard and whispered a quiet prayer for strength, though she no longer knew which God to thank or blame. The nurse folded her spare uniform, her gloves, and the notebook where she had written every word she dared. Beneath her mattress, she found the sun-bleached cowboy hat a guard had once given her as a joke. She stared at it for a long moment. The memory of that day came back clearly. The laughter, the smell of hay, the faint sound of a harmonica drifting through the air. It had been the first time she felt human again. With trembling hands, she placed the hat on top of her belongings. When they stepped outside, the camp looked different. The fences that had once gleamed like threats now glowed softly in the morning light. The guards stood quietly, their faces unreadable. There were no speeches, no salutes, only the sound of boots on gravel and the distant cry of a train waiting on the tracks beyond the trees. At the gate, Thomas, the farmer guard, waited with a clipboard. He nodded as each woman passed, calling names from memory. "Take care now," he said. "Keep your heads high." His drawl stretched the words until they felt like kindness. One woman tried to speak back in English, fumbling with the words she had learned. "Thank you." He smiled and tipped his hat. The nurse was the last to leave. As she stepped through the gate, she turned once more toward the camp. The wooden barracks stood silent under the sun. Smoke drifted from the mess hall chimney, and she wondered who would eat the next meal cooked there. She felt the weight of all that had happened. Fear, grief, laughter, guilt settle over her like dust. She whispered, "Goodbye," though no one heard. The train waited on a siding beyond the fence, a long line of cars with open doors and soldiers standing by. The women climbed aboard in silence, the boards creaking beneath their feet. Each carried a paper bag with food, bread, apples, and dried meat. A final gesture from the men who had once been their captors. Some women held the bags tightly, others couldn't bring themselves to touch them. As the engine groaned to life, the nurse leaned out the window. The camp shrank behind them, the fences fading into the horizon until only the water tower remained, a thin silhouette against the sky. For a moment she thought she could still smell smoke, the same gentle, earthy scent that had greeted her when she first arrived. She closed her eyes and breathed it in. The train rolled east through the plains, the land stretching endlessly, golden and calm. They passed small towns, farms, and the slow-moving shapes of cattle. The nurse watched it all, her reflection flickering against the glass. Around her, the other women sat quietly, each trapped inside her own thoughts. No one spoke of home anymore. They knew what waited for them: emptiness, graves, and questions no one could answer. When the train stopped for water in Oklahoma, the guards opened the doors to let in air. A breeze swept through, carrying the scent of grass and faraway rain. The youngest woman began to cry quietly. "It smells clean," she said. "It smells like before." The nurse placed a hand on her shoulder but said nothing. Some wounds couldn't be comforted, only carried. Days later, the train reached the port. Ships waited in the harbor, grey and massive, their decks crowded with soldiers and supplies. The women were herded down the platform, their paper bags still in hand. The sea spread out before them, wide and glittering. For many, it was the first ocean they had ever seen. For all, it was the line between two worlds, one they had survived and one they were about to face. Before boarding, the nurse turned back one last time. Behind her, smoke rose from a small fire near the docks, where workers burned old crates and rope. The scent hit her like a memory too sharp to bear. It was the same smell, the same mixture of wood and warmth that had once meant fear, then mercy, then guilt. It filled her lungs, and for a moment she could see it all again. The barbecue pit, the cowboys' smile, the women laughing for the first time, the harmonica echoing over the fences. Her eyes burned, but she did not look away. She wanted to remember it exactly as it was, the moment she learned that kindness could wound more deeply than cruelty, that forgiveness could live in the same world as loss. As the ship pulled away from the dock, the coastline shrank. The nurse stood at the rail, holding the paper bag of food close to her chest. Inside, the dried meat still smelled faintly of smoke. She didn't eat it. She couldn't. Instead, she pressed it to her heart as if to hold on to the feeling that had changed her life. Years later, when someone asked her about her time as a prisoner, she never spoke of fences or guards.